Once again, I'd like to thank you for coming and welcome you back after this morning's session, and perhaps draw your attention to the program and the speakers who will be speaking with you this afternoon. I will once again take a small opportunity to thank a number of people who I didn't take the opportunity to thank this morning. Most notably, my advisory group, which is made up of David Leighton Brown, Sheila Embleton, and Noel Badzer, who, in essence, have been a driving force behind this symposium today. I once again also want to say how much we appreciate the work of the TRC and how much they, too, have been a driving force for this happening today. I also want to remind you that this event will be completely taped and will be available on the York website within the next maybe 4 or 5 weeks. So if anybody is interested in viewing it in its entirety, it will certainly be archived. We are incredibly fortunate to have wonderful people here today. Once again, most notably, the survivors who have immense courage. And if I'm boring you by my admiration, that's just too bad. The survivors deserve our admiration. The survivors deserve our respect. The survivors deserve our attention. And this is a day for them, as much as it's a day for education. This afternoon, we're extremely fortunate to have Professor Emeritus of Native Studies, Mohawk Studies at Trent University, Marlene Brant Castellano. Marlene Brant Castellano is an Order of Canada, and she will remind you of the influence that she has had on a particular book that everybody should be reading. I have read part of it, and it certainly is a deeply moving document to do with healing. I won't take any more time. I'm just simply going to introduce Marlene, and I'll ask you to give her acknowledgement. Marlene. Thank you. Marlene, thank you. I'll bring water.
Okay, that's good.
So do it next, just this.
Okay, thank you. Segal, good morning.
You're going to have to speak.
Good afternoon already.
That's right, you're going to have to speak closer to the mic.
Okay. I extend greetings and thanks to the Mississaugas who are the traditional stewards of the land that supports our feet in our gathering today. And I thank the conference organizers for the privilege of speaking on the conference theme, Linking Arms Together. In some recent work on research ethics, I heard harsh criticism of helicopter researchers, which referred to academics who flew into First Nations and Inuit communities, gathered data, and then flew away to construct their interpretations, which were often wrong-headed. I have to apologize for being a helicopter speaker today, though traveling by car and train, because of a health issue at home. I will be leaving right after my talk, and I won't be participant then in the interesting proceedings of the rest of the day. So, apologies. Linking Arms Together is the title of a book by legal scholar Robert Williams, who is an expert on early relations and treaties between colonists and First Nations in what is now eastern United States. The images called to mind by linking arms together are the figures on numerous wampum belts, especially those of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois peoples. They memorialize agreements and treaties, some you may have come across already. I have displayed there a copy of a replica of the two-row wampum belt that has been mentioned often. And I have here a friendship belt a friendship belt also called the covenant chain, where you see a white figure and an Indian figure. The white figure has a dark heart, and the Indian has a white heart, which is interesting imagery. And they are bound together by a silver chain, which doesn't break like a hemp rope and doesn't rust like an iron rope, but it does get tarnished. So when the peoples come together, it's necessary to polish the chain of friendship. Wampum belts contain rich symbolism, and the interpretation of those symbols is committed to faith keepers who, when gatherings, meetings come together, hold the belts and read what has been put into the belts. The figures of people linking people of different backgrounds, different cultures, from different lands, linking arms together, indicates the vision that inspired the traditional treaties, and that is that we share our humanity and we have values that we recognize among each other, and those enable us to be in relationship, to have friendship, to trust one another, and in particular to share the land that supports our feet. The belt that is up there is a Mohawk belt of ancient origin. I don't have a date, but it is an Indian and white man. Some say a French or English king, sometimes just symbolizing white men. And at the ends are two dog-like figures, which are named as wolves, totem animals who are keepers of the peace, keeping guard over the peace. The next one is called a Wyandot belt, and the figure on the left is the governor, said to be the governor of New York, and the dark figures are 5 Iroquois nations, and the Wyandots, or the Hurons, who made a treaty, an agreement. And this one is called the Ganasatake belt, which is said to have originated in 1721. And it signifies the lengthy land. They're standing on the white line, which symbolizes the land. It speaks of the extensive land that the Mohawks of Ganasatake were promised. And the belt was reportedly first presented in 1721 and brought out again in 1787, when the lands around Lake of Two Mountains changed hands from the French to the British. And you'll see that there is a cross symbolizing their adherence to Catholic faith and the Catholic faith, and the promise to have a priest among them. And again, they have the two dogs, or the two wolves, guarding the agreement. Colonial governments and their representatives adopted and exchanged wampum belts to cement agreements which the colonists interpreted as land transfers. The First Nations understood the treaties as sacred commitments to become friends and kin, to maintain peaceful relations and share the bounty of the land through generations. And these wampum belts are still used as reminders and teaching tools to recall to us the values, the values of our ancestors, our connection to the land, and the agreements that have been made. The vision of peaceful coexistence, however, has been repeatedly fractured by conflicts over land. And 2013 marks 250 years of trying to resolve those conflicts, going back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. When I saw the videos last winter of Idle No More flash mobs and round dances in malls across the country, I was caught up in the spontaneity and hopefulness emanating from them. First Nations and Métis, who often are at odds in the West, young and old, long-time white settlers and newcomers with various complexions, were linking arms together and speaking about Indigenous rights and justice and imagining that they would make a difference. Could this be the generation that revives the vision of distinct peoples recognizing and respecting one another? It's happening already in communities across the country with the frequency of cross-cultural, intercultural relationships and marriages, of which mine is one. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, in its 1996 report, made its theme, its overarching theme, restoring a relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples that would be based on principles of mutual recognition, mutual respect, sharing, and mutual responsibility. And those were the values, that was the vision of the treaty makers, our ancestors, in creating those wampum belts 300 years ago. The shift in thinking, however, that was required to actually act on the Royal Commission report and relate to Aboriginal peoples as partners in confederation rather than dependents, and the scope of recommendations to restructure that relationship met resistance and indifference and at times hostility in the halls of government, with the exception of residential schools. The establishment and funding of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was the single substantive government response to RCAP's 5 volumes and 444 recommendations. There was rhetoric about a new relationship, but the only substantive decision, policy, was the residential school healing fund. Last year at the Law Society of Upper Canada, there was a gathering considering follow-up to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation as it enters the final year of its mandate. Participants talked about the challenge of implementing findings of commissions of inquiry, and I made the observation that governments who establish commissions of inquiry are the least likely suspects to act on findings that require long-term investment or that depart from existing priorities. So what provoked action on residential schools? Some insider reports indicate that faceless bureaucrats also have hearts. They were touched by the evidence of systemic abuse of children that was in conflict with Canadian values. The Healing Fund of $350 million, created in 1998, would help victims to heal, and it has done so while the program lasted. However, it wasn't the end of the matter. As people and communities engaged in open communication, open conversation about their residential school experience, they were strengthened to join together in class action under law to seek more recognition and redress for cultural and spiritual losses that they had suffered and continue to suffer. So in 1997 came the residential school settlement, and a mandate for the TRC. The Commission of Inquiry and the Program for Hearings, a Historical Record, and Public Education that RCAP had recommended almost 10 years earlier. In 1998, the Prime Minister, on behalf of the Government of Canada, made a moving apology for the errors and harms of residential schools. In the past 4 years and longer, truths have been told about children's experience in residential schools and the intergenerational impacts of those experiences. There is healing in telling stories and having them heard with compassion. But healing of individuals, important though it is, does not change the relationship and the attitudes that gave rise to social, cultural, and physical abuse. Is reconciliation, the restoration of harmonious relations, is it possible if trauma continues to be visited on First Nations and Métis and Inuit children and adults? We continue to hear about the unresolved murder and disappearance of Aboriginal women along the Highway of Tears in British Columbia. Year after year, high school students boarding in Thunder Bay drown without explanation. Housing crises and boil water advisories plague isolated northern reserves. When the desperate situation of an Aboriginal community, especially as it affects children, is exposed on the evening news, it touches the heart of the nation because it contradicts who Canadians say that they are, a just and caring people who have created one of the best nations in the world in which to live. The majority of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people do not share that good life according to the yardsticks we use to measure such things: life expectancy, health, education, and income. And we know that shortfalls in those areas in the midst of well-being and affluence easily lead to poverty of spirit and despair. The inequalities are so many and so complex that it's not easy for people of goodwill to know what they can do. So we search for a way of restoring relationship, a path to reconciliation. For 250 years, confrontations between Aboriginal peoples and settler governments have been about land. So long as the original peoples of this land are deprived of gaining a living from the wealth of the land, there will be poverty and discord. So long as Canadian citizens are deprived of knowledge that the disadvantage of Aboriginal people is constructed and maintained in their name, there will be no action to balance inequalities. An Inuit student at Trent was taking a course in international development and learning about Indigenous peoples around the world. And he said, the young people back home should hear about this. They think the misery in their lives is their fault. The path to reconciliation runs through the land. It's about the land. Always about the land. Let's reflect for a few minutes on the history of relations surrounding land. Despite the early agreements to maintain peace and friendship, increased immigration and unscrupulous land dealers contributed to conflict between First Nations and settlers. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 set some boundaries on European settlement, and in order to dampen armed conflict on the borders, The proclamation decreed that Indian tribes were not to be disturbed in possession of their lands, and those lands could only be given up by the tribe to agents of the Crown in a public transaction. So the Royal Proclamation became the basis for treaties in Canada, but continuing different interpretations of what was protected by the Royal Proclamation continue and have become the basis for Supreme Court cases argued before the Supreme Court since the Canadian Constitution of 1982, when it became legal for Indians to hire lawyers. And now we have our own. You've heard about the disputes. Lands which have never been ceded, as in British Columbia, are the basis of ongoing litigation to establish claims. And in the Delgamutte decision, Justice Lemaire sent the case back for revisiting in British Columbia and said, don't litigate, negotiate. Let's face it, we're all here to stay. A modern interpretation of linking arms together, standing on the land in peaceful relationship. These disputes, and where there are treaties, the continuing argument is whether Indian tribes gave up everything, their right to live on the land and harvest a living from the land in return for $4 a year and a suit of clothes for the chiefs. The Indian nations who signed these or made their mark on these agreements, these treaties, said that the renewal each year was like the tradition of renewing promises, polishing the covenant chain of friendship, renewing and honoring the promises that were made. And these disputes are the historical background of the recent conflict between Gitchinumet-Kusib, Ininewug, or KI First Nation, and their protest against mining interests in northern Ontario on their traditional lands. In 2008, 6 members of the KI First Nation, the chief, 4 band counselors, and a band member were sentenced to 6 months in jail for protesting against mining development on their traditional lands without consulting them. KI Council had exhausted all their funds for legal fees and resorted to going out on the land to stop the heavy equipment. A court injunction ordered them to stop protesting, even though the provisions of their treaty and a Supreme Court ruling on another case made consultation and reasonable accommodation a requirement. The KI community appealed the jail sentence and won on the grounds that the punishment was excessive. The band council was released from jail, but the federal and provincial governments continue to authorize permits, licenses for exploitation, recovery, or of minerals on the same lands. We recall other acts of resistance, the Innu in Labrador lying down on runways to protest the disruption to their lives caused by low-flying NATO flights, training flights, over lands which the government maintained were mostly vacant. The conflict at Ganasatagi in 1990 over the building of a golf course on burial grounds. The protest at Ipperwash over the expropriation of a community's lands and homes under the War Measures Act, lands which had not been returned to the Chippewas of Stony Point 45 years later. 45 years after the war ended. And that confrontation resulted in the wrongful death of Dudley George and a subsequent public inquiry. A land dispute dating back to the so-called Riel Rebellion in 1870 made the news recently. The Manitoba Métis Federation won a Supreme Court decision that declared the federal government had sullied the honor of the Crown by failing to fulfill a promise made as a condition of ending the 1970 rebellion, which gave birth to the province of Manitoba. A grant of 5,565 square kilometers of land was to be made for the children of the Red River Métis. The government was cited for delaying the allotment of lands for 15 years, during which time the land on which Winnipeg sits was flooded with European immigrants who were hostile to the Métis. The federal government argued unsuccessfully that the claim was more than 100 years old and no longer valid. I haven't read the judgment, but a report that I read said that part of the judgment said that this was a failure to honor the commitment was a tear in the fabric of the nation. It touched the Constitution, and there was no statute of limitations. Blackfoot lawyer and scholar Leroy Littlebear has called such confrontations jagged worldviews colliding. And when such collisions have been reviewed painstakingly in court cases, commissions, and inquiries, the justice of the Aboriginal claims, with few exceptions, has been validated within the meaning of settler society law. Still, when confrontations disrupt business as usual, the view that's reinforced by government response and media coverage is that a few lawless Aboriginal individuals are threatening peace, order, and good government. We're no longer savages outside the palisades. Now we're threatening civilization from the streets and highways. Land claims are framed as potential charges on the public purse or dislocation of settlers' property rights. When Aboriginal people eke out an existence as impoverished individuals on the margins of urban industrial society, they're not much of a threat. When they assert that they are nations with collective identities and historic rights, when they form coalitions to press their claims and seek redress under law and the support in international forums, their presence, like climate change, becomes very inconvenient. People of goodwill who feel the contradictions in the relationship with Aboriginal peoples, Mohawk, Cree, Inuit, Métis, often ask, what can we do? It's my view that changing the dialogue, changing the conversation, recognizing who we are, respecting our distinctiveness and our right to live on this land, sharing the bounty, and accepting mutual responsibility, like in the tradition in the ancient treaties. Real respect for Aboriginal peoples and their continuing place in Canada must involve living space on their territories and a just share of the resources on and under and flowing through their traditional lands. That's the reconciliation that Justice Sinclair and Commissioners Littlechild and Wilson have been trying to open up in the discourse about truth leading to reconciliation. Their mandate is coming to a close. And the climate in Canada is that is seeming to accept the story, the narrative that we can't afford a social safety net. We can't afford to have a compassionate society. We can't afford just and equitable and inclusive relationships. The Idle No More movement, the walk of those 9 Cree youth from Wapmagoosty saying, we are here, we know this land, we have traditions that enable us to survive hardships, inspiring people. The challenge is, how do we make the connection between clearing space through the recognition of rights and the well of responsiveness and goodwill of people who want healing, who want youth to thrive. And that is a challenge that those who are working on and with the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People are setting for themselves. How to make those good words about justice, about relationship, how to make them real in Canada. I'm sorry that I won't be able to stay to hear the wonderful ideas and experience that will be shared later this afternoon. Nyawa, thank you.